That Fiona there? Yeah.
We're done. Right. Hello.
Well,
Oh, hold on. We've got a late entry. Thank you everyone for joining in today for this exclusive interview with EDDIE FLETCHER. So for those of you who don't know EDDIE, EDDIE is a sport and exercise physiologist and a specialist indoor rowing coach. He's coached to several world, British and indoor European rowing champions and record holders. So EDDIE was the physiologist and indoor rowing advisor to the successful Oxford Women's Boat Race squad from 2013 to 2016. Outside of rowing, he's the lead Wattbike sports scientist, and he works across several sports, so triathlon, track and road cycling, rugby union and rugby league, football and other sports, as well as with university and sports science laboratories and sporting associations around the world. So I first met EDDIE last year at the British Indoors, and since then he has been coaching me. However, he's become so much more than a coach, and he's certainly become more of a mentor for me, and really helped develop me as a coach. I've learned lots from him, so I was absolutely thrilled today that he agreed to be interviewed, so he could share his wealth of knowledge and experience with everyone, and actually, you know, help you guys improve your performance. EDDIE today will be discussing his training methods and also the science behind those methods, the importance of recovery, amongst many other things. This will hopefully really help you guys improve and take your training to another level. So if you have got any specific questions today, guys, just feel free to use the chat, and either myself or EDDIE will pick the questions up as we go. But yeah, over to EDDIE. Thank you so much for agreeing to be interviewed today for what is your first, and you have said it is going to be your last interview as well.
probably for a reason.
So first question, EDDIE, why haven't you done an interview previously?
A good question to start with. It's not something I've even thought about doing in the past, to be honest, because I prefer to do and to work quietly with my athletes and the various sports bodies around the world that I work with. I think the big problem with interviews, and it will happen today, is trying to get over the context of what I'm saying and what I do. And interviews are very difficult to avoid misunderstandings. But one of the reasons for agreeing to this interview is part of the process of me, if you like, getting some of my stuff out there. I'm not getting any younger, to say the least. And when I'm gone, I'd like something out there as a legacy. So I've recently done 3 webinars for Wattbike on cardiorespiratory fitness in the medical world, and therefore I'm going to be putting a bit of stuff out there for webinars, for videos, and I'm going to be writing up quite a lot of my stuff. I've not really published an awful lot, that's fairly time consuming, but I've started writing up quite a lot of things around the various sports and around the methodology. And I'll start releasing those hopefully over the next year, 18 months. So at least there will be something out there from all the years I've been doing this. So that's the reason. I prefer to do things rather than talk about them.
Brilliant, thank you. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of your training methods, I'm sure everyone would be maybe interested to actually know how you yourself got into coaching and how your training methods actually evolved over the years.
Yeah, this is my, if you like, my second career, but it's now 25 years in. I've always been involved in sport, particularly when I was younger. I played lots of sports. I actually ran to quite a high level. I played league squash and 1 or 2 other things. So I'd always been involved in sport, and obviously with my own two sons growing up, getting involved in looking after what they did as well. And then I was pretty ill back in '97. So I decided I needed to do something else. So I actually went back to university, and I did a master's in elite athlete physiology. And then started developing, the Fletcher Sports Science from there. I was very fortunate that I knew quite a few people in the sports, so I was able to get contracts fairly quickly. It's not easy to make a living as an independent sports scientist. There are very few independent sports scientists. Most work within universities or within sports organizations. So it was, it was starting from scratch and building from scratch. And I started, some of the people listening will remember coming to my garage to be tested and so on and so forth. And then we moved to premises and so on. And I was quite fortunate to start working with Wattbike even before the company was formed. So I've been the lead sports scientist for Wattbike since we started the project back in the early 2000s. So the last 20-25 years has really probably gone past me at such a rate of knots. It's untrue. And I've been able to work I've been fortunate to work in many sports and still doing so.
Great, thank you. So on to your training methods, Eddie.
Some of the people listening will have heard some of these words before, but maybe not the deeper stuff. Because I do prefer my athletes just to get on with it, and, as you do, and one or two others, and do the sessions. The base of the methodology is about establishing structure. As you know, I'm very structured in what I ask people to do. And once you get the structure, you also get that consistency going on. It's about that consistency of what you do, and not over days or months, but over years. Because best performance is not built short term, it's built long term. And then the third element is, once you've got that consistency, you progress people on. And that progression could be in a number of ways. It could be just maintaining, particularly as you get older, maintaining what you've got at the best level it can be, or particularly on the younger ones, getting a better and better performance out of people. The progression generally takes people towards a goal of some description. It could be, for rowing, it could be a 2,000 meter race, it could be a 10-mile time trial, it could be a triathlon, it could be even a game of rugby, where we use the same sort of methodology to get them game fit, if you like. So that's the first element of it. And then the training itself, and this is where a lot of misunderstanding comes, because I think, and we're going to be talking about it, people think my training is heart rate training, and it's not. The heart rate is one of the metrics, which we will discuss in some detail, because it's quite an important one. But I have two elements to the training, and it's probably easy enough to spot when you've got one of my programs. The first one is the physiological bit. We've got to get the physiology up to its scratch, and then get it embedded and adapted within the body. And that's all about utilizing the oxygen transport system of the body to its optimum. And that takes a lot of doing, it does take a lot of doing. And that's the bit which I always control by heart rate, along with other metrics. The second element of it, and again, my athletes will have seen this, is that sustained power, pace, speed. It's what I call the mechanical bit of it. So you've got physiological and you've got mechanical. And when you switch to the mechanical, the sustained power, pace and speed, the heart rate is second to it. It's a secondary to your stroke rate or your RPM if you're on the bike or whatever you might be doing, where we concentrate on building that race pace, if you like, so that you can compete at your top end for the period of time. So it's the sustained power over a race is what we're trying to build there. So the physiological, the mechanical. And then the third bit of it is recovery. recovery is such an important part of what we should be doing. And recovery takes many forms. There's even recovery within some of the sessions. But that's, you know, we won't go into that one in itself, but recovery is so important. And recovery is important because the physiological adaptation occurs when you're recovering. When you're training, when you're doing a training stimulus, you're actually causing some damage to the body, and it has to recover and adapt from that. So your recovery is that really important bit of the equation. And I think my athletes have heard me use this term. Overall, we're looking for that adaptation of the body to the physical response, you know, the physical stimulus, and the accumulation of the training. Accumulation of training is a really important concept. So you're trying to build into your body that repeatability of what you've been doing, which will give you the underpinning for your optimum performance. So when you look at a training plan, let me pick one. I know Rod's listening in. So Rod's doing a 100K plan of mine. He's got a lot of accumulation to do to get to where he wants to get to.
Just that's 100K on the rower.
On the rower, sorry, that's 100K
on the bike.
Not on the rower, 100K on the bike. Slightly easier, probably.
Exactly.
So yeah, rowing for just over 7 hours. So you have to do a lot of accumulation along the way for his body to adapt to be able to do that. And as people have seen, Rod's just done virtually 2 back-to-back 3.5 hours, 50K each one. And I'll come back to the amount. You know, I know we got a later question about how much should we be doing. So that adaptation accumulation is quite important. So that's the method, the overall method. Structure, consistency, and progression. There's a physiological element, mechanical element, and the recovery. And what we try and do is get that adaptation and accumulation over a period of time. And that period of time, by the way, could be years.
Yeah.
There's too much quick, you know, there's no quick way of doing some of this. You can't do it in a week, a month, 3 months. And that's why I've got athletes who have been with me years and still getting performance out of them.
Patience and persistence is the key.
Yes, quite. I'm putting it
Great. And so you spoke about sort of the two different, or so, you know, the two different, the sort of the oxygen transport, and then you've got that sustained power. How much training time should we sort of ideally be spending in each of those sort of zones?
Yeah, it's always a difficult question. Is that one? It doesn't really depend what you're doing. There is a mix which you need to get. Because if you work, and I hate the phrase, but if you work hard, in other words, high intensity all the time, you're going to hurt yourself, and you're not going to get the balance you need. So for all the sports I work in, one of the base things we do is 75 to 80% of the work is at that physiological level, and then 20-25% is at that mechanical level where you're trying to sustain the pace or improve your sustained pace over a particular race distance. For the body to adapt and accumulate, it needs to do an awful lot of physiological work. And it will vary from athlete to athlete, but the ratio tends to be fairly similar. It might well be, if I just move on and explain the things that we're measuring as well.
Yes, that was my next question.
Oh, was it? Right, okay. So you're always looking at a number of things. So you're looking at duration. How long should a session be? And you'd be surprised how short some sessions can be. And generally speaking, most people overtrain, that I find. So duration is important. You then look at some of the technical stuff. So you're looking at, for rowers, their stroke rate, for cyclists, our RPM and gearing. You're looking at the power, or the power to pace relationship, the frequency, how many sessions should you do a week, and so So there's an awful lot of stuff that goes into knowing how much you spend in each training zone. It's not an easy one to do, because then you have to balance off with that time in the training zone with the recovery, the nutrition, and the sleep, all part of the equation. So, for instance, you wouldn't do consecutive days of something at a high intensity, because you wouldn't be able to recover from it too well. So, how much you spend in each training zone is a difficult one. But if you take a general guideline, 75–80% at the physiological level, and they shouldn't present any great problems from a recovery point of view, 20–25% will be at that sustained power level, where you are putting in some quite intense type stuff.
That's great. And as far as like the intensity, how do you sort of measure the intensity of the sessions, like, the sustained power, for example?
Yeah. I measure with all the parameters. So there are certain levels. So let's pick the rowing machine. Anything up to about 24 strokes with the correct heart rate involved, and the correct duration and pace relationships, which we can come back to, is a low intensity for me. So that's the physiological area. Once we move from 24 strokes to 26 onwards, then heart rate becomes secondary, and we are in that sustained power, where you will be doing shorter interval type work. And I'll say shorter, some of it is 2Ks, 1.5 Ks, that sort of stuff. We're not talking about the real top end sprint stuff here. So there's some cutoff points, which I've just started to write sort of a little fact sheet on that, to say, here's where your cutoff point is when you would switch from using your heart rate to focusing on the pace and the stroke rate relationship. And I have the same thing for cycling, for running, for swimming, for some of the rugby drills we do, where we know we work out which bits are physiological, which bits are mechanical, so that we can separate the two out and measure the right things.
Brilliant. So you mentioned heart rate and the importance of that, obviously, in developing that oxygen transport system.
Yes.
There are lots of methods out there, which obviously give very different heart rate targets, depending on which method you follow. Which method do you recommend, Eddie?
Right. Real heart rates, simple as that. I'm amazed at what I actually see still being taught in schools on PT courses, particularly the infamous 220 minus your age. Any formula that has an age-related basis in there is probably not the best way of doing it. It indicates that everybody of the same age has the same max heart rate, which isn't true by a long way. And I've given you a slide which we're going to put up shortly, so we can move through that. So my method is based on making sure you established your actual figures, so your own max heart rate and your own resting heart rate. Now, I do use heart rate reserve quite a lot, but I also have an algorithm which translates that into a maximum, a percentage of maximum heart rate if people want to use that methodology. But we've got to use real heart rates. So we're establishing a real max heart rate and a real resting heart rate. Now, not everybody should do a max heart rate test, because that's the only way to get a max heart rate is do a max test. But there are lots of sub-max protocols that you can use. So for instance, on the cycling front, and wear my Wattbike hat, I've designed into our app, into our monitor, quite a lot of different tests, and there are sub-max tests in there. And sub-max tests can be very, very accurate in terms of estimating what your max might be if you do them correctly. So there's a way of getting a more realistic max heart rate by not falling off a machine of some description. Although I have to say, athletes I always test to max, because that's what they should be able to do. But there are a lot of people where I start them off on a sub-max, so get some estimated figures and then move them on to a max figure later on. I think probably it's a time where maybe we put that first slide up, Heidi.
Let's see if I can do it.
Yeah, so I wanted to concentrate a little bit on heart rate, despite the fact my methodology is a mixed methodology, but I wanted to get rid of some of the myths about heart rate. Slide comes up.
There we go.
There we go. All right. So this is, let me just put it up large on my screen as well. All right, here we go. Right. There's lots of stuff talked about heart rate, and I use this one because this is a fairly recent one. It's a 2015 study from the Mayo Clinic, and it's a running study. But you can say the same for rowing, for cycling. When we test the rugby players, same sort of stuff. And it's one of the reasons why you can't use this chart illustrates why you can't use an age-related heart rate or any formula really. So if you look at this, what you've got a 10-year age bands, quite a big study, quite a lot of people involved, which I quite like. And the first thing you'll notice is that the mean heart rate, and we'll come back to that, but the mean heart rate does go down with age. And we know that, and even for athletes. But it's a big range. And there you'll see there's a plus or minus figure next to those mean figures. And that's the variation you're going to get just over one standard deviation. So if we take that first age group, 2029, 190 plus or minus 11 beats. So that's a swing of 22 beats just for one standard deviation. And when we're looking at science, we look at more than that. So in fact, the range of variation can be quite huge. So if you use an age-related calculation, or in fact a mean figure, you could be so far out. People will be undertraining or overtraining, depending what their individual figure is. The other interesting thing is there is no difference between men and women, as you can see. Just slight variances, not significant variances at all in there. So very difficult to use any age-related formula to get your heart rate. Do find out what your own max is and measure your own resting heart rate as well. Do you want to put the next slide up for me?
No probs. Actually, just on max heart rate, I just had a question in from Milan saying, is the max heart rate you get at a 2K or 5K? Or so how would you measure your max?
You might get your max in a 2K or a 5K or a 10K, but you can never be sure. So it has to be, you've got to do it in the test. So I have, and I will be revealing them. I've developed over the years a max heart rate test. You've probably seen mine on the Wattbike, but I've got a max heart rate test for the rower, for runners, and so on and so forth. And I will be putting some of that out. So there's a protocol to get you to your max heart rate. It also gives you some other stuff. It will trigger off your zones such as they are. So it's not a bad test to do. I've also got a sub-max version of it as well. So Milan, if you want to send me an email, I can give you some guidance on how you do that. But yes, you might see a max heart rate in an event, but the trouble is you don't know if it's a max unless you've tested your max. All right, so I wanted to move on to talk about heart rate drift and people thinking that inevitably the heart rate will drift, but in fact the heart can be trained. This chart won't be unfamiliar to my athletes. So part of that adaptation and accumulation will enable you to row, ride, swim, run with a very flat heart rate at the level you want it to be. And in fact, this is Harry Helen. Harry's viewing in. Harry's a great master of doing this. The infuriating thing for my athletes is asking them to slow down. But if you're doing the physiological training, what you need to do is slow down to keep the heart rate in check. Over time, you'll get the right match of heart rate, power, speed, pace, whatever however you think about these things. So Harry, that's another great session from Harry in there. So it is achievable. Heart rate drift is not inevitable. It will occur initially, and of course, if you're racing, it will gradually creep up. But I want to show you something on the race side fairly shortly on that. Right, next slide then, Heidi, for me. All right, so this is quite an unusual one. You can see the numbers are difficult to scale out because this is 4.5 hours. This happens to be my own son, who set a world record for paddleboard in the length of Loch Ness about a month ago. But as you'd expect, he's a master of the art. But that's 4.5 hours. You can see how level that heart rate is, and in fact, how level his pace is. You know, level pacing at your optimum is what you're trying to do on most things. You'll see that heart rate looks a bit wavy. It's not really. There's a difference between being prone on the paddleboard and on your knees. So when you're paddling, you have to switch between the two because the body gets too much stress. So as he switches from prone to upright, back down to prone, back up to upright, you can see those little peaks and troughs. On a paddleboard, when you're prone, lying down on it, your heart rate's higher than when you're kneeling up and paddling that way. But you can see how level all of that is. You can even see on this one, on the pace chart, you can see that there's 3 dips there. That's in fact when the wind and the waves knocked him off the board. So he had to get back on the board and recover. But you can see how you can achieve that over many hours. And we see that with marathons, with triathlons, with Ironmans, all that sort of stuff. So it is an easy thing to achieve if you get the physiological training correct. It underpins everything else that you might do. All right, next one then, Heidi. There's just a couple more on this. So this is one of his training, we'll move on quick. This is one of the training sessions, but again, during the training, again, because it's physiological level, again, a very flat heart rate and a flat pace. Okay, moving on, Heidi. All right, wow, this is the first time this has been put into the public domain. This is a trace from one of the Oxford Women boat race squad. But we had a process of building them up to be able to do 20 minutes on the erg and 20 minutes on the water, roughly, for the boat race, at huge level of their max. So this is a 6K, there's a warm-up in there, and then there's a 6K. There's very little drift in that. They're straight up there on pace, and they're keeping at 95% of their max heart rate, 95% of their max heart rate for 20 minutes. When I first said to the Oxford coaches, this can be achieved, they didn't believe me. It can't be achieved. You can't keep your heart rate up there for 95% of the time. Well, obviously you can, and in fact, every single rower in that squad over time could do that. The other thing they had to do, you want to put the next slide up, Harvey?
Oh, yeah.
The other thing they have to do is be able to do 2 of them, 2 6Ks. And again, we're going to be at, we're at 95%, just below at 90 to 95%. And again, the coach didn't believe that could be done, and it can be done. And just a little bragging here, 4 boat races before things changed. We won 4 boat races, and Oxford haven't won since, because they've gone back to what I call conventional type training. But that's what you're trying to do, that sustained power period. You want to sustain it at the highest level you can. And everybody can do this. And I know we've got a question coming about age later on, but even at age you can do this as well. Mr. Chin's a good reference for that one. So you can train the body, but there's a lot of physiological stuff going on before we get to this stage. You can't just do it, and you have to build it. And if all you do is short to high intensity stuff, then you're going to get away from what you're trying to build and all of that. Now I know there was a couple of questions on heart rate, which we may as well deal with now. Paul Freeman, hi Paul. Paul asked about max heart rate and resting heart rate. Are they predictors of performance? My answer is essentially no, but yes in a particular respect. Max heart rate is genetic, and it varies as we find. Whereas resting heart rate can be improved with training. So as your resting heart rate comes down, it's not particularly predictive performance, although it will tell you something about your own fitness. So you're getting fitter and fitter, and therefore that might make you faster and faster over your particular event. But max heart rate is not going to indicate, someone once said to me, oh, my max heart rate is 205 and therefore I'll be a good athlete. Not necessarily so. I had an Olympic level athlete with a max heart rate of 148. So max heart rate is essentially genetic. It's the difference between your max heart rate and your resting heart rate in terms of what you're trying to achieve. So Paul, the answer is a yes and no. Your resting heart rate will give you an indication that you are getting fitter as you train. I had one from Tim Marsh. Hi Tim. On my marathon plan, my rowing marathon plan. His question was around if he finds over the time that his heart rate is coming down for a particular session, should he keep the session at that heart rate, or should he push the pace to match the heart rate? The answer is both. You need to make sure you don't look at one session. So my heart rate was low on that particular session. You look at a series of sessions, and then if it's adapted to a new low heart rate, then you do push the pace up a little bit from the pace charts. Okay, Heidi, so I think that's enough on that particular one.
That's great. So I just saw a question come in from Justine, I believe. What's the likelihood of your max heart rate changing over the years? So for example, Justine had her last test done in 2011.
Yeah,
so how does it change?
Yeah, it just changes. Athletes, over time, your heart rate, as you get older, your heart rate will come down. But athletes can maintain it at a much higher level for longer. But inevitably, it will come down. I found that with my own athletes. So it's best to do a test occasionally. You don't need to do many tests. If you do a test once a year just to establish it, you never actually know whether you've done the max heart rate. I've worked with athletes who are at the top of their game, and then all of a sudden you do a test and you push an extra beat out of an extra 2 beats, whatever it might be. But certainly as you age, you ought to just make sure that you're working your numbers from the right figures. Very similar to your resting heart rate, you need to check your resting heart rate as well to see how that's moving. So if it's 2011, Justine, I think probably I would test that again, just to make sure you've got the right numbers for the physiological effort that you might have to do. I meant to mention there's a caveat on max heart rates and resting heart rates, by the way, particularly for older athletes. If you're on any medications, then it might not be, the figures you see might not be the correct figures. So if you're on blood pressure medication or heart medication, very difficult to use heart rate as a parameter. You probably have to use perceived exertion. So just be aware of that. If you're on medications, it may affect your heart rate.
Great. Thank you, Eddie. You mentioned earlier overtraining. So, you know, how do I know how much training I should be doing? How much is too much, or, you know, how little is too little?
Yeah, you don't. Simple as that. And what you need is a coach, an expert who knows what they're doing. Seriously, I mean, this is a serious point. There are a lot of people training or exercising without the structure and the consistency in the progression, and without the knowledge around how the body works and what the numbers mean. You really need an expert to tell you. I mean, it's fairly difficult for me to do, and I do it every day, just making sure that, you know, that my athletes are doing the right amount, not doing too much, and they know when to go into recovery and that sort of stuff. I do have another one of my calculator algorithms, which tells me the recovery time for a particular session. And I know there's a lot of that stuff out there. You know, there's the Garmin watches and Sunto watches will give you a recovery time. They are too generalized. If you measure it specifically, you'll get you'll get a different figure. So the answer is, get yourself a coach who knows what they're talking about, and all of that. Yeah, there are some general parameters I could put around it, and I probably will at some stage in a little document, and a fact sheet. But you've got to be really careful. People, exercise is a bit of a drug, and your body craves more and more and more, and overtraining will hit you like a train. You won't know it's happening until it happens. So it's asymptomatic up to a point, and all of a sudden you fall off the cliff, and your performance starts to go down, and you're getting ill. And there are some good indications here. If your heart rate doesn't come down fast enough when you've been training, if you're getting lots of different little types of illnesses, and so on and so forth. But yeah, you've got to be so careful and get all the rest in. So the number of sessions you do a week and the ratio of those sessions is quite important. So just as a general rule for my athletes, if it's a single sport and they're younger, they will do probably 6 sessions a week and have 1 day recovery. The older you get, and we have a question about that for over 50s, but it starts earlier than that. But the older you get, the more careful you have to be. Recovery takes a lot longer. The other stresses of life are affecting your ability to train. Work stresses, family stresses, all that sort of stuff. So the older you get, you have to be a lot smarter about it. And my older athletes will do either 5 sessions a week or even 4 sessions a week, depending on the sport they're involved in. So yeah, you've got to have a good coach who knows a little bit about this sort of stuff.
Great. And so getting on to more sort of general questions now. Are there any differences between how you train men and women?
Yes, quite a lot. Women are very good at training. Men are not. You have to keep on top of the way men think they should be doing something. Men always want to train to max all the time. There's testosterone in there. Wanting to make a training session competitive. Training sessions are not competitive. I do smile a little bit when I see somebody say, oh, I've had a personal best in a training session. To me, there's no such thing. It's just the progression of the training, and it'll vary day to day. But men tend to try and make sessions competitive. And my athletes who are listening will know some of the banter that goes around, where people are trying to beat the parameters I've set for them without getting told off and put on the naughty step, so to speak. Men are different in that sense. They make everything competitive, whereas women tend to be, if you like, more compliant and understand. Women understand a little bit more about what he's trying to achieve. They listen to their bodies more as well. And there are some other differences which would take a lot of talking about around the menstrual cycle and one or two other things which we're beginning to realize is quite important. Doing less training around the cycle. There's bone health. There's one or two other things that you need to be aware of as well.
Right, great. Another big area that everyone does like to talk about is lactate, Eddie.
Yes, and you'll notice I haven't mentioned it at all.
So, that's what I did notice, so that's why I'm bringing it up.
Well, all right. I haven't done a lactate test. I've still got all the kit since probably, I'm just thinking 2010, maybe. Lactate probably is 50 years out of date. Lactate is not a problem. Let me explain what I mean by that. Lactate it's got a bad name, and in fact, it's quite good. Lactate is buffered quite well by the body up to a certain point, and is utilized to coat the muscles. It prevents a little bit of fatigue. It's also a source of fuel when the body's struggling, the heart and the liver take it back as fuel. And even at the extreme, there's not that much lactate in the body on that. But lactate limits performance, if you like, if you think like lactate. So there are lactate tests that are still being done where it's akin to 220 minus your aids. So we've got a 2 millimole level and a 4 millimole level. Indicates everybody's the same, and they're not. And if you train to a lactate level, then you're going to limit your performance. So what I tend to do, well, I don't know so much what we do. What we want to do is make the oxygen transport as efficient as it can be at the highest level it can be. So if you go back to those graphs, being able to perform or have the oxygen transport system operational at 90–95% of max heart rate for prolonged periods. So that's the whole basis of it. The thing that stops performance is not lactate. Lactate doesn't stop the performance. The pain that people feel is not lactate, and it's certainly not lactate acid, by the way, because that splits up straight away, it's formed, but it's the hydrogen ion that splits out. So that's what it is. It's what it is. So what we're trying to do for that adaptation and accumulation is to make the oxygen transport system as efficient as possible. We now know that there's never a lack of oxygen. And you hear this phrase, anaerobic, which in strict terms means without oxygen. The body cannot work without oxygen. And we know from biopsies that even at the end of a particular race where you're hurting, there's enough oxygen in the body. It's just that the body can't utilize it. So that physiological training that I do is the element of oxygenation. You're using the oxygen to its optimum before you're stopped in your tracks. And of course, you'll be at a much higher level of performance. But no, I'm aware that, and there's lots of terminology about, lactate threshold, lactate training, and lactate tolerance, and this sort of stuff. If you concentrate on that physiological development of the oxygen transport system, and then you top on the sustained power, pace, speed, where it might be, that will improve your performance. You don't even need to think about lactates. When I was with the Oxford crew, we never did a lactate test at all. We never did those things, despite the fact the men's team were doing that, and they couldn't believe that we weren't doing it. We did heart rate tests, of course. We did VO2 max tests, because there's this relationship. And by the way, the heart rate ranges I use are linked to VO2 max. There's a good relationship between your heart rate and your VO2 max, your body's ability to utilize the oxygen. That's what we're looking at. So we did a lot of that measurement, but we didn't do lactate. And we performed pretty well winning 4 boat races on the trot. So I don't mention lactate in anything I do, apart from I remember I did do an article somewhere, it's on the internet somewhere, about about lactate in terms of it's not a problem. Don't let it limit your performance. Look at the bits that you need to train to get it right.
So slowing down really does make you faster.
It does. It does. Somebody a long time ago now, one of my Ironman ladies, I used to call her, sent me a mug because I kept using this phrase, slow is the new fast. But of course, it's not slow, slow, slow. The other, because I think that Heidi, we did have a question about really low heart rate training is no good for you, and it's not. It's okay as a recovery. So that low heart rate stuff is not as low as you think it is. So it's a mid-range heart rate, if you like, before you start to move into sustained power. I only use really low heart rates for it could be an easy 30-minute recovery, or spin your legs out on a bike, a little bit of rowing, or a little bit of running, whatever it might be. But yes, going on the physiological bit, get the heart rate right first, see those straight lines we saw from Harry and one or two other people, and then the rest will follow. The rest will follow. As sure as eggs are eggs, your power will start to go up, your pace, your speed will start to go up. Because as soon as your heart rate's lowered down, you put more pace and speed and power in to get the heart rate back up again to where you want it. So there's that leapfrogging effect of getting fitter and fitter and faster and faster.
Great. Thank you, Eddie. And advice for sort of young athletes. What are sort of your top tips for anyone who's just coming into the sport, Eddie?
Well, there's an awful lot of stuff around about this now, and if you ever get the chance, look at Professor Ross Tucker from South Africa, who did a devastating presentation on young sportsmen. Don't specialize too early. I think youngsters need to develop across, and get used to lots of different types of sports, different movement patterns, so on and so forth. Don't forget that youngsters are not many adults. Their physiology is different. So you can spoil a young athlete if they start too early specializing. They can overtrain very early, and there are lots of sports, I won't mention them, where their youngsters are brought into the world talent schemes, and then they're spit out at 17, 18, 19 because they're overtrained and injured. So it's a matter of don't specialize too early. Make sure you certainly don't overtrain. And it's not always about being faster and faster. It's about getting the techniques right. With youngsters, it's more about skill acquisition because they haven't got the physiology. So getting the swimming technique right, getting the cycling technique right, getting the rowing technique right, all of those sort of stuff. Making sure that the youngsters understand recovery and particularly nutrition. Nutrition's a big issue. Inactivity in youngsters is huge, and we think it's not. We think everybody's getting active nowadays, but in fact, 60% of the UK population is obese. And in children, there's only 47%. This is the latest figures. Are getting enough exercise per week. So there's a lot of stuff about nutrition as well around that to get all of that right. So I've actually take your time. The other thing I ought to put in, because Ross Tucker, if you look at his presentation, it's in there. The interesting research: the average age of an Olympic champion is 28. And when you look back, there are the odd athlete who was very good when they were young and carried on being good. But most of them didn't specialize in their sport until they were 16, 17, 18. And that's quite telling because I watch a lot of coaches, a lot of sports, and it happened with my own grandson, where he's 11. The coach at the swimming club said, unless you make it now, you're not going to make it in the future. What a ludicrous thing to say. Still developing, still growing, and what they should be concentrating on is a skill acquisition and all of that. So it's not always about being you know, the best at 12, 13, 14. There's a huge drop off in those teenage years. And that's because they've specialized too early and been overtrained in those early years.
Great. So you train a whole load of different athletes across a range of sports, Eddie. Do you change your training plans for each sport, or is sort of other foundations very similar?
The foundations are very similar. The technical aspects are completely different. So how you ride a bike is different to how you row on a rowing machine or indeed in a boat. How you play rugby union or rugby league, the technical aspects are different. But the underlying physiological stuff is very similar. The emphasis on what you're training, which bits you're training, may change from sport to sport. But I always set off on the basis of, this is my overall philosophy, like methodology. Now let's look at the technical aspects that we need to put on top of that, which will dictate what the sort of sessions may be. So if you saw some of my rugby sessions, they wouldn't be recognizable to a rower or to a runner or to a swimmer. They are completely differently. And unfortunately, I can't really publish any of those. Confidentiality is always a problem with certainly the international rugby squads. But yes, the underlying physiology, you know, the human body is the human body. The underlying physiology is very, very similar, but the technical aspects of the particular sport will be are different.
Great. And so you've been involved now in sports science for a few years, Eddie.
Yeah, just a few.
How have you seen it change, and how do you see it developing in the future?
Interesting. It's an interesting question, because there's not a lot of sports science about in sport, as you'd think. It takes a long time to change anything in science. You need to build a body of evidence on things. And then it takes time for it to filter through to the individual sports. And lactate is a classic one. I mean, lactate research is probably 50 years out of date. But it's handed down from coach to coach, from athlete to athlete, player to player. So it's very difficult to get the up-to-date sports science into a lot of sports. But it's just true to say that a lot of sports now are getting sports scientists in, and more coaches are listening to sports scientists along the way. But I think we've got a long way to go, to be honest. It's probably the most frustrating part of the job. You know, when I go to, and I don't do them now, but I used to go into schools to give little lessons, if you like. When I see in their textbook they've taught 220 minus your age, and I know it's still being taught on PT courses. It's extremely difficult to break down, because that's a very stark example of what is wrong. But it's very difficult then to put in some science. The other thing about the school's work is the child physiology. You can't use heart rate on a child, because they don't have a well-developed heart. And what you'll find is, you see a normal heart rate curve. Children don't have a normal heart rate curve, despite the fact they can perform well. Their heart rate comes up and it stays up there. So they're always performing, their heart's always performing at a higher ratio, if you like. And it takes a while to develop that. The science is not taught that well in schools or on coaching courses. A lot of old science in coaching courses, unfortunately. But I'm ever hopeful. It is getting better. It is getting better. You are seeing sports scientists in soccer, football, in rugby, and so on. So it's getting better and better.
You need to get writing your books, Eddie.
Yeah, it's a boring part of the job, is that, Donna?
Okay, so I'm just looking at the chat and any questions that we might have missed along the way. A question from Martin Evans. how would you assess optimum stroke rate for an athlete when approaching a specific distance?
Oh, right. Okay. Yes, Martin. Hi. There's a tight range, by the way. There is a tight range. It's about like cycling as well as a tight range, but there is a range around that. I always give my athletes, and Heidi will know this, I always give you a slight range around a session, plus or minus 2 strokes around what we want. Unless you Rod Chin, where you need an extra 10 strokes, don't you, Rod?
He's getting better.
Let's put his thumbs up. But there is a range. There is a range. You can come up with a general range, and I do, and then you have to adapt it for the individual athlete. So you're talking about 2K. My start point is always sort of 30 to 32 for a 2K. But you do get some people can do it at 34, 36. Then you get some people down at 26 and so on. So I always start, well, let's widen it a little bit, 28 to 30, 32. And there's some science behind some of this, because on a rowing machine, I'm sorry for the non-rowers listening in, but on a rowing machine, there's a curve that goes away from you. You use energy on a rowing machine to move your body up and down the slide. And that curve is non-linear, and it moves away pretty fast, Martin. So just to give an example of that 2K, if you go from 30 strokes to 36 strokes, you're putting about 50% extra energy into just moving the body and not creating any extra pace as well. So getting those high stroke rates is generally speaking not too effective. There are people who can master it to an extent, because the other thing on a rowing machine is your technique will go to pieces. You're flashing up and down the side too much, your technique goes to pieces as well. So those optimal ranges. When I'm looking at a 5K, it's 28 to 30, 10K, 26, 28, and so on. Because you've got the duration to account for and all of that, which also counts against you in terms of how many strokes, how much energy you're using, Martin, across up and down the slide. So I do have some, again, I will put that together in a fact sheet anyway, some general guidelines on stroke rate. It is a tightest range, and then you get you always get the exceptions to the rule. Mr. Chin is an exception to the rule. Although Rod, you have got faster and faster by reducing your stroke rate a little bit. So it's a general guide, Martin. But if you email me, I'll give you some more specific information.
And I guess the same applies, Eddie, to cycling, as you know, with the RPM or the cadence.
Oh yes.
And then the gearing.
It does. It's amazing how many cyclists, indeed, I hate to say, cycling don't understand what a gear on a bike does. Because a gear on a bike doesn't make you faster or slower. Depends how many revolutions you can turn it at. So whichever gear you're in, one pedal revolution will move X meters across the ground. How fast you go will depend on how many RPMs you can push it at. And the bigger the gear, the harder it becomes to get the RPMs up. So there is a range, yeah, but it depends what you're doing. So there's a general range I use, which is 90 to 110 for general cycling. But I work with track sprinters, and the beauty of track sprinters, they only might be sprinting 1 lap, 2 laps. They're on a big gear, as well as having leg speeds up to about 150 RPM. So it will be very specific to the cycling event. So you've got the real long, the Ironman type thing, where you are going to be probably at 85 to 95, something like that, depending on the gearing you're using. But leg speed is good physiologically, but you have to train it in. I saw a piece of research recently with just 9 participants, which said, your effective pedaling rate is X. It was fairly low, but they didn't do any adaptation intervention to get the leg speeds up. And it can take, a good year to get leg speeds up. So a lot of my cycling programs are built around getting the leg speed at the right ratios for the particular event they're training for. And cycling has huge range of different events, from very short sprints to the Tour de France. Although if you saw the leg speeds of the of the tour riders, they're quite high. You know, even going up the mountains, they're quite high. Low gear and spinning their legs up the mountain. But yes, similar thing goes on. I work out the ratios again. So you've got rowing ratios, I've got cycling ratios, running ratios, even swimming ratios. So there's lots of things like that going on.
And actually, just quickly, at the other end of the spectrum, obviously you've got your high leg speeds, but you've also got, you know, your sort of low leg speeds, and people do use sort of, you know, maximum force, lower leg speeds to actually try and increase strength on the rower or on the bike. What are your thoughts on that, Eddie?
Well, you know my answer to that already.
I know, that's why I'm asking you.
There you are. Don't do them. Strength is a strange word. Strength technically is the ability to lift a weight. You know, if you want to improve your strength, go in the weights room and do a very structured weights program. Don't waste your time trying to do it on the bike or on the rowing machine, where it compromises quite a lot of stuff. So it'll compromise your technique. It can cause injury. It's what I call, it's not really technical, but it mashes the muscles, it hurts the muscles and chokes the engine. So it chokes the physiology as well. As you know, I put everything in the right ratios, as opposed to perceived wisdom, conventional wisdom, oh, we've always done it this way. Well, try it a different way, you might well be surprised about it, yes. So, yes, the big gear, low cadence syndrome, none of my athletes will do that. And somebody on the rower, none of my athletes will do putting maximum power through at a low stroke rate. No great advantages as far as I'm concerned. And I've got lots of data to back that up over 25 years.
Yeah, that's great. And also, I'd just like to, you know, mention, I have noticed, you know, your athletes, generally speaking, do stay injury free. And, you know, yeah. I think that's a testament to maybe that philosophy.
It's part of it, but part of it is from what we talked earlier, getting the amount of training right, the training load right as well, knowing when to throw in some recovery, even recovery weeks. As you know, I throw in recovery weeks when I think an athlete needs it. So there's a lot of things go into that injury prevention. Yes. Yeah,
great. And I think there's one final question that we've missed out on, Eddie. Bear with me, and that's from Milan. Do you have any views on the so-called orthostatic test that Polar does, which is based on heart rate variability?
Well, two aspects to that. Heart rate variability, I use it all the time. I was one of the early adapters, and I have a lot of software. My athletes, if they've got the right piece of kit, they can send me their files, and I use heart rate variability quite a lot. My recovery algorithm is based on heart rate variability, basically translated into to heart rate and duration. It's not for me to comment on Polar. What Polar do is what Polar does. Same with Garmin, same with Sunto, and so on and so forth. I do know quite a lot of the algorithms that are behind. Don't forget, a lot of these things have to be very generalized as opposed to specific. You know, a recent experience, one of my athletes did a session. I think the Garmin watch said 13 hours recovery. My piece of equipment would tell me the recovery within 2 or 3 hours. It was a very low aerobic type operation. And then sometimes it comes up with your recoveries that these days when it's clearly not on that. So you can use these devices as a general guide, but there's no substitute for, again, doing some very specific works with people who've got the equipment. And I know it's difficult. It is difficult. Polar and Garmin have to generalize what they do. It's as simple as that.
That's great, thanks, Eddie. And Helen is just asking about training as you get older.
Hi, Helen. Helen's not getting that old yet, Helen. Yeah, Helen and I have worked together for a long time. Yeah, as athletes, I think I mentioned it earlier on, as athletes get older, they do need to be more careful. There's more recovery needed, probably more attention to their nutrition, and doing less. And the less becomes more, of course. So you've got to really target the type of training that you're doing. You can't constantly beat the body up as if you're a 20-year-old when you're a 40-year-old, and so on and so forth. So it's accepting that you are getting older. Physiologically, the body is slowing down. Things are happening. You can maintain it a little bit. Men can maintain their fitness a little bit better than women can in the middle age. Women, being to do with hormones, women will decline at a steady rate. Men can hold their performance a little bit in middle age, but then they will go to decline. So the body's going into decline. You have to accept that and manage that as well. Real key to what I do really is trying to manage that decline, that you can still perform optimum. And that's the key. What you often see is, say, people in their 40s suddenly coming into a sport and on a dramatic improvement curve. Well, it's not really an improvement. What you're doing is getting to the optimum for where you are now. And if you'd done that when you were younger, you would have been a lot better. So you're trying to get your body to you come into a sport in your 40s, you're trying to get to optimum for where you are now, and then you're trying to hang on for it. You're trying to hang in there, and in the end, you won't be able to do anything about the decline, but you can probably still perform very well.
That's great.
Helen's not old yet.
Actually, and we've just got one final question
Okay.
from Charlotte about pregnancy and
Yeah.
coming back from pregnancy, Eddie.
Yeah, I'm not a specialist in this, so you need to find a specialist, and there are specialists around. But essentially, the body has to do some repair and recovery, so it's taking it fairly gentle and not suddenly trying to throw yourself back into what you used to do. But you will come back strong. It's not a great deal about it. So starting off with some walking, some swimming, some light aerobic work, that type of stuff, and just ease back in over 3 to 6 months. But I'm not a specialist. And I'm not sure I've had a pregnancy for any of my athletes. So if I did, I would find an expert to rehab them back to normal on that.
That's great. Eddie, thank you so much for your time today. I really appreciate it, and I'm sure everyone else does. Hopefully we've all learnt lots. I'm sure if anyone has got any further questions, just give me a yell or Eddie, and we can address them. So yes, I hope everyone enjoyed, and thank you so much for joining. And yes, happy training, everyone.
Okay, yes, and look out for me publishing a bit of stuff from now on.
Yes, keep an eye out for Eddie's work. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.